Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you all join us for this first webinar of 4 in our Emerging Priorities webinar series. Today, the focus is on the COVID constituency, using polling insights to drive education change. Just a few logistics. Given the size of our audience, we have all attendees muted, but we'll have the Q&A feature available. So please engage with our presenter and panelists throughout today, as we will leave time at the end to answer some audience questions. We also encourage you to please use Twitter to engage in the conversation using the hashtag COVID Constituency. Today, we are lucky to have an esteemed partner moderating today's discussion. Former West Virginia Governor Bob Wise has spent his career advancing education opportunities for our nation's students. In 2019, he completed 14 years as president of the nonprofit Alliance for Excellent Education. He currently coordinates the Global Science of Learning Education Network. Governor Wise served 24 years as governor, member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and state legislator, and has become a prominent speaker and advisor on education issues and trends. Governor Wise, I turn it over to you to start today's discussion.
Thank you, Cheryl, and many thanks to the Hunt Institute for the privilege of partnering on this important initiative that's being launched this week, and it starts this week with issuing a comprehensive report called the COVID Constituency, Emerging Priorities for Educational Leaders. And I also want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its support for this report. So, a little background. For almost 2 years, COVID-19 has caused the American public and the world to undergo a searing shared experience of education shutdown, homebound schooling, physical and mental stress, and economic hardship. Think about it for a minute. 70 million students, pre-K to graduate school, at least 60 million more adults joining them at home as extended caregivers. There's not been this type of shared experience since World War II. There's a simple reality that pre and post-COVID, any major changes in education require public support. This is reflected in public opinion, as well as the fact that ultimately, most decisions in education will be acted upon by elected officials, from the elected school board members of 14,000 school districts to state officials to the Congress to the President of the United States. Where there is strong public will and concern, education and policy leaders respond. Think the GI Bill after World War II, the Soviet Union launching Sputnik in 1957, launching massive investments in science and math, the Civil Rights Movement forcing school integration, public concern following the Nation at Risk report. This report, the COVID Constituency, will document a growing movement that is shaped by this shared experience, a true COVID constituency. Presenting a variety of polling and survey data, the report states that the COVID constituency has developed strong views on education improvements. Why is establishing the presence of a much bigger, broader, more informed COVID constituency important? Because it converges with a once-in-a-lifetime federal and often state education funding to address COVID concerns. Do education and policy leaders feel the necessary public support? Do they see and feel the COVID constituency? Are they willing to take bold actions to move education where we want and need it to be, rather than just where it was pre-COVID? First, we will hear from Celinda Lake of Lake Research Partners, whose recent poll for the National School Boards Association went the deepest I have seen into how the public views have been shaped by the COVID experience. Celinda and her firm are well known for polling, particularly in the education arena. She is a Democratic pollster, and in polls such as this, she partnered with Chesapeake Beach Consulting, Bob Carpenter, a well-known Republican pollster, so that they could truly pull from both parties what the public is thinking, and also in some ways establish what maybe transcends party as to what the public is thinking. But this poll, as I say, is seminal. Thank you to the National School Board Association, Chip Slavin, whom I'll be introducing later, for making it available. Celinda, could we start with you?
Thank you so much, Governor, and always a pleasure to be working with you. And we have had the great fortune of doing that for over 20 years. So thank you so much. And I want to thank the Hunt Institute for their leadership. I want to thank the National School Board Association, Chip Slavin, who you'll have a chance to hear from later, for his vision in formulating this poll and really intellectually driving it. And I want to thank our team, Jesse Klein, Alicia Snell, and Bob Carpenter, our partner in this. This was a poll done in April 2021 of likely 2022 voters. And you can see we have oversamples of African American, Latinx, AAPI, and Native American voters and parents of school-age children. We're going to share the big picture findings with you and the things directly relevant to this conversation. But you can get all kinds of demographic subgroups, and we will be on later to answer any questions that you have. So as we remember, April 2021, people, and this has long been a trend, that people have a very positive view of public education when they think of their schools locally, and tend to be more positive locally than when they think nationally. They are also more likely to see their local school board doing a good job as opposed to politicians or elected officials at state or national levels. Those are pretty long-term trends. What we're really interested in are some of the things that Governor Wise lifted up and the new agenda that is emerging in the post-COVID America, which is really dramatic when it comes to education. People start out absolutely convinced that there has been tremendous learning loss among students, and it's deeply, deeply concerning to them, not just to parents, but it's the biggest problem in education for nearly every subgroup that we looked at. People also think that a top challenge that local public schools faced during the pandemic and continue to face, this is not a short-term problem, is having quality broadband and high-speed internet access at home to attend school online, and then the internet, the connection of the internet to personalized learning, which I'll show you that data as well. There is strong support for increased funding for education, and we're having this conversation at a very timely moment when, of course, nationally it's being debated, really an investment of a generation in education. And people are very aware that this is a unique moment, and there is strong political support for elected leaders who support increased funding. There is also very broad overall support for personalized learning, and this is an issue that COVID really brought into its own. And people believe strongly that increased access to the internet and broadband is essential for the kind of learning that we need in a global economy and a 21st century world, and the kind of personalized learning that they're looking for. This is particularly strong with African American and Latinx voters. When we talk about the priorities that people have for education, we mentioned already learning loss among students due to COVID pandemic. The other big problem that is very salient, particularly for blue collar people and Latinx folks, is not teaching real world skills. Both of those are perceived to be very big problems in public education today. 65% of people say that learning loss is a very big problem. 88% say it's a problem. Frankly, those numbers are so high, they really aren't even a debate in the public anymore. They are almost a core value. 51% say this issue, it is an important issue to address, extremely important issue, and 83% say it's important. You're looking for bipartisanship? This is where you obtain bipartisanship. 61% of Democrats, 64% of independents, and 71% of Republicans say it's a very big problem that there has been so much learning loss among students. And similarly, for not teaching real world skills, 53% say it's a very big problem, 81% a total problem, 45% say it's extremely important, 80% say it's important. One of the things that we have been talking about for 30 years, and I think I first heard this term actually from Governor Wise, and like many people at the time, I had no idea what it meant. 74% of people say there is a lack of personalized learning focused on individual needs. And people think that is a real issue now. 38% say it's a very big problem. 32% say it's an extremely important issue. And 72% total say it is extremely or very important. This is an issue that, interestingly, COVID has really brought into its own, and it's not being nearly talked about enough. This is a major, major reform that people want. People also think that keeping schools safe and lack of quality teachers is a problem, but they are feel they are kind of at the top of the second tier. Very important, but less acute than the learning loss and the personalized learning, interestingly enough. People are very clear about the challenges of the COVID-19 environment. And this report that Hunt is about to put out, really, really seminal, revolutionary, very important, and the public is there. People feel overwhelmingly that there is a challenge in terms of broadband access. And you want an issue that unites parties and unites rural and urban voters. This is your issue. In fact, the most rural voters and the most urban voters are the voters who are most concerned about this. 65% of African-American voters, 52% of Democrats say this is a very challenging issue. Other challenges: retaining teachers and preventing them from leaving the profession, teachers having adequate resources to support and effectively teach their students virtually, students having access to counseling and mental health resources. This, by the way, is a huge issue, and it is the millennials who are really driving this counseling and mental health issue. They are adamant about it, and they bring it to a number of issues, including education. And then teachers and other school employees having access to counseling and mental health resources as well. If we look at the next chart, 3/4 of voters say COVID pandemic makes them think ensuring children have access, students have access to technology and broadband is more of a priority. This issue has completely arrived. It is, while Democrats are particularly intense about this issue, it is truly a bipartisan issue. And as I said, it truly unites the most urban voters and the most rural voters. And coming from rural Montana, I can tell you that this is a very, very strong issue in rural America. We just finished a study in Montana where this popped to the #1 issue. This is probably, the next slide is probably the most interesting and dramatic slide I'm going to show you. So this is comparing 2020 data and 2021 data. And I want to thank the school board for their early insight into this issue and getting this data. And you can see both the perception as a problem and the perception of this being an important issue to address has jumped dramatically between 2020 and 2021. COVID has really fueled this. And so overall, 47% of people thought this was a problem in 2020. Now 65% say it's a problem, and the intensity has doubled. And 50% thought it was an important issue. Now 64% think it's an important issue, and intensity has gone from 20% to 33%. So this is a very, very strong issue, a very salient issue to people. People support increased funding, and they totally believe it should be increased at this time. They realize that these new priorities that they have mean that we're going to have to spend more money. 86% would support increased funding, even if it meant they would pay more in their own taxes. This is stunning because people are pretty tax sensitive right now. But even if this would pay more in their own taxes, and of course there are many proposals that have other revenue sources, feel that this is an important issue and they're supportive of increasing funding. Intensity of support is particularly high with voters of color and Democrats, but it's high across the board. The other point is people would make this a voting issue. They're ready to take this to the polls. 45% of voters say they are more likely to vote for an elected official if they support increased funding for schools. Only 34% say it would make no difference in their vote, and very, very few voters say they would be less likely. Interestingly, frankly, stunningly, probing the whole tax increase doesn't increase opposition. People say they would be more willing to vote for a candidate who supports increased funding, even if it raised their taxes. People do not take raising their taxes right now lightly. They're very worried about incomes and rising costs, but this is such a priority. It surmounts that tax sensitivity. The next slide, and of course, this is national data, but we see the ratings of the job that people are doing in terms of education and public education. And most elected officials are getting pretty mixed reviews. The school boards are net positive, but most elected officials, people think, are not paying enough attention to this. And you can see, and this is something that is very, very salient right now, very important data right now, both the Democrats in Congress and the Republicans in Congress were getting double-digit negative numbers here for their attention to education. So people want to increase funding. They're willing to do it even if it would increase their taxes, and they're willing to hold their elected officials accountable. Women voters, voters in the Northeast and Midwest, voters in suburban and rural areas, parents of elementary age children, and moms are the strongest in their feelings about this, and also the most likely to listen to their school boards, by the way. What have we got here? We have an emerging constituency. We have an issue that has changed and morphed and is as salient as it ever was. And we have people ready to act in the 2022 elections on these issues that really aren't being talked about enough. So let me turn it back, Governor, to you. And thank you so much to all of you for listening.
So Celinda, thank you very much. I believe you will have to leave, but your associate at Lake Research Partners, Jesse Klein, will stay around to answer questions. And thank you. And once again, what struck me about this poll is you pulled out, you delve deeper than any poll I've seen or survey I've seen so far into how people are feeling now that they've come through COVID. And I was particularly struck, and we're going to talk about it some more, about some of the things you pulled out that they're definitely thinking about, and that's personalized learning and broadband mental health, social emotional. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to our panelists, and it's a great panel to be discussing these issues. I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to introduce them all now, and then ask them to answer some questions. So Chip Slavin is Interim Director, Executive Director, and CEO at the National School Boards Association, which he joined in 2019 as its Chief Advocacy Officer. And there he's led the Federal Advocacy and Public Policy Group representing school board associations. These are the elected members, for the most part, the 14,000 school boards across the country, incidentally, where 90% of the federal dollars go to be distributed through the federal stimulus relief packages. Chip represents the NSBA before the U.S. Congress and the administration. He's also headed the efforts of the National School Boards Association, the NSBA's National Grassroots Organization, and the Center for Public Education. And when he's got his spare time, the Research Tank, which examines issues impacting public education. So you can see a lot's happening at the National School Board Association. We're fortunate to have Bib Hubbard. Bib has been active in education for many years with a variety of organizations, but she founded, significantly for this discussion, Learning Heroes, which helps parents most effectively advocate on behalf of their children's educational success. And she brings extensive experience in communications, policy, and advocacy from Bib. I think you've covered pretty much every base, from the public, the private, and the philanthropic sectors. And finally, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Danette Howard, Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at Lumina Foundation, the nation's largest private foundation focused solely on increasing student access and success in post-secondary education. Dr. Howard oversees several of Lumina's key strategies to increase America's attainment of high quality post-secondary degrees. And I think, Dr. Howard, this poll goes to that a good deal. Post-secondary degrees and credentials, including strategic work in both state and federal policy and efforts to leverage states as the drivers of credential attainment. She also leads the Foundation's Equity First efforts to embed racial equity and justice in all aspects of Lumina's strategic work and operations. And Dr. Howard, just to round it out, you bring a practical experience as well, having been having served as Secretary of Higher Education in the state of Maryland, leading the state's post-secondary education coordinating agency, the Maryland Higher Education Commission. So all of you, I'm going to start with Chip, because Chip, your folks are ultimately going to be the ones voting on how these dollars get spent and whether or not how these priorities are recognized. So my first question to each of you is, can you discuss what the conversation around education during the pandemic has been among the constituents and the stakeholders that you work with? Chip, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that school boards right now, school board members are probably getting more attention from the public than they have in years. And part of that is because of the decisions that school board members have to make, particularly regarding the pandemic, whether to have masks or mask policies or not in the schools. Are the buildings going to reopen? Is there going to be some kind of blended learning where you're in person some and you're remote some? All these issues are at play, as well as a lot of social issues and political issues that are popping up. But right now, I think the thing that school boards are trying to concentrate on is how to reopen the school building. And I say the building, but schools have never really closed. The learning continued, but much of it was online. But reopening the building safely so that the students and the teachers have a safe environment to go to, and how to do that in a way that gives the teachers and the students a lot of freedom in their learning to get a lot done, but also, again, is looking at things like community spread, how to limit the numbers, and how to make a safe environment. And unfortunately, with the Delta variant of COVID-19, we're now seeing that children and young people are being impacted much more severely than they were in the early stages of the pandemic. So I think a lot of the focus right now, Governor, is really on, by school members, is really focused on how do we do this? How do we leverage all the science and the information combined with sort of the community input and make the best decisions for our kids and our local schools?
Just a observation, we actually touch on it in the report that's coming out, is seems like school board members have both short-term issues to deal with and then also long-term, getting back into school. Once you're back into school, what do you want school to look like, particularly in years to come? So Bib, the folks that are going to be most concerned about getting back into school are the parents and those that you work with so closely. What are you hearing?
Yeah, we've been, since 2016, we've consistently been listening to parents, teachers, principals, students, guidance counselors, but in particular, since May of 2020, we've been sort of consistently in the field, both qualitatively and quantitatively, listening to parents and teachers. And we take a much more personal approach. So Celinda just presented sort of what drives voters and how people are showing up in the macro around education, and that's hugely important to our policymakers. We ask parents about themselves and their children and what's happening in their homes, and we ask teachers about what's happening in their classrooms. So our lens is this much more kind of personal take, and I'd say overall, parents and teachers both are exhausted. They have been experiencing this whiplash, as Chip was saying. Last year, schools were open, but there was lots of different forms of that. So, they were in, they were out, they were hybrid, they were remote. There's just sort of this, the uncertainty of what happened last year has really, I think, taken a toll on families. And especially as they think about, you were thinking about this year. I mean, our last quantitative poll was, and actually February, March. So just right before Celinda's poll. And at that time, parents were really thinking about next school year and sort of reeling from the exhaustion. But interestingly, we also heard great optimism. So parents and teachers both, despite everything that's happening, feel like they've they've gotten through this together. They've made it work. They're getting through it and feel optimistic about their children's success in the future. So I think that's important to note as well. But again, as Chip was saying, 70% based on a poll that the CDC and the PTA just did in August, 70% of parents believe that the pandemic is not over and that we still have a ways ahead. So I think that the health issues, the safety issues are taking sort of a higher precedent in parents' minds and hearts these days, as well as teachers, just that safety. And, kind of some other important observations is, everybody had a different experience. So those 14,000 school districts that you talked about, there was such a wide variance around how children were served. And so I think parents acknowledge that everybody had a different experience, but everybody had an experience. And so this issue of learning loss for parents, that term actually, again, as you think personally about my child, they sort of bristle at that term because they don't feel like their child lost learning. They feel like everybody sort of hit pause almost, and everybody had this experience and everybody's sort of in the same boat. So I think that's why we've started to see in education a switch to a more asset-based frame around accelerated learning, and let's help get our kids, on track as quickly as possible, but keep those expectations high. And finally, two quick things. One, parents did see their children regress. So they had this front row seat, and I think teachers, we heard this from them as well. Children were regressing socially, emotionally, and academically. And it was quite painful for parents to see what typically would motivate their child no longer was motivating them. They literally were saying, they won't take their blanket, off of their heads. They won't go outside. They won't play basketball like they used to do. They can't focus. So I think for parents, that social, the emotional, the mental health piece is quite important, as well as for teachers. And I know we're all sort of focused on that, but parents were able to sort of see that up close and personal. And I think that is impacting their outlook. And I'll finish by saying mostly parents want to know what's expected of their child. So I think as we think about how we can help support parents is helping them understand what is expected of their child and how should they know that they're meeting those expectations. And that again is socially, emotionally, and academically. This isn't just about academics. Parents don't separate it. So I think it's important to think about it holistically, which I've been encouraged to see that I think, most school districts and states are prioritizing that the social, the emotional, and the mental health. And I think that is meeting parents and families where they are right now. So those are some of the themes that are emerging.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Howard, this COVID constituency we talk about, 20 million of these, of the 70 million are in some sort of post-secondary program. When COVID hit, most of them then had to revert to digital learning. And as Bib Hubbard is talking, then I'm also coming to grips with the fact that many of these who were in job training programs or post-secondary could also have been parents as well. And so what in your work, what are you seeing and hearing from this particular group?
Yes, thank you, Governor. While the survey results focus primarily on K-12 education, I think you could just extend the tail of these findings right into post-secondary and higher education. And many of the same findings would resonate with today's students and also with individuals who are doing their best to support today's students. What I've heard most routinely is that the pandemic just highlighted so many of the inequities that we've already always known have existed, but the pandemic just really put a bright light on them. And so it was impossible to ignore them anymore. And Tony Jack, who's a professor at Harvard and wrote a book, The Privileged Poor, I think he summarized it best when he said that when colleges had to precipitously close in March 2020, for some students, they got a pink slip and an eviction notice on the same day. Because for many students, college is their employer, college is where they live. And while many were able to pivot pretty seamlessly into 100% virtual learning, they were able to go home and have a space to work and learn, and they had devices and high-speed broadband internet. That certainly was not the case for all students. And so for those students, the pandemic has been difficult, challenging. It's caused many students to disrupt their plans for post-secondary education. In fact, another survey showed that 35% of students either changed their plans or canceled them altogether. And of course, we know there are significant differences by race, ethnicity, and income among those groups. And we've also seen some significant macro effects. We've seen college enrollment declines, the likes of which we've really never experienced before. Year over year, from spring 2020 to spring 2021, enrollments declined by about 600,000 students, most significantly in the community college sector. And we know that for many students, community college is their pathway into a well-paying job and to helping them support their families. We also saw considerable inequities in terms of broadband internet access, who has devices in order to do their work. And so I hope we'll be able to dig a little more deeply into some of those issues as the conversation continues, Governor Wise, because again, when we disaggregate the data and look at specific groups, we see that some had a much more challenging experience as we went to 100% remote learning than others did.
I think you make an incredibly important point. I sit on a 4-year accreditation, one of the regional accreditation commissions. And what I have been struck by, and I just wanted to ask your insights, is that in many of the institutions, and particularly those that were striving to bring equity measures and to really bring it to the fore, when COVID hit, as you say, everyone scattered. And so, and a lot of students who were depending upon the campus for structure, for social, for employment. You mentioned all the important aspects of it. All of a sudden, they're thrust back into their communities. And so, how do we? And then you mentioned the declining enrollment. How do we get that back? What is it that needs to be done, policy or practice, to bring them back?
Sure. Well, I think this is an opportunity for us to permanently rethink how the system of higher education can best support the needs of today's students. So there's still this sense that the vast majority of students are coming right from high school. You know, they're supported by their parents. They work on campus for maybe 5 hours or 10 hours a week. But the reality is that many of today's students are older. Almost 40% of students are older than 25. 24% of students, Governor, are parents themselves. 40% work full time. And so what kind of higher education system do we need that can support the post-secondary experiences of those students? Because we know that today, in order to get a good job, and the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce defines a good job as one that pays $35,000 for those under 45 and $45,000 for those over 45. About 80% of the good jobs that are available today require some learning beyond high school. So we need pathways and we need holistic student supports that will facilitate not only the enrollment, but the continuing persistence of all sorts of students. And Governor, you also just reminded me that we not only saw inequities between and across student groups, but also between and across different institutions. Some institutions did not have the technological infrastructure to support 100% virtual learning. They weren't set up that way. So when March 2020 hit, they had to scramble just to get their classes online. They didn't have faculty that were equipped to teach in a virtual environment. So as we see inequities across students, we've also seen them across institutions and institutional types. And that's also something that we really have to pay attention to. And
one thing also that I noticed, Dr. Howard, is in the 3 federal stimulus relief bills culminating in the American Rescue Plan, there's very little money actually for job training in there, except for healthcare workers. I think the thought was we'll wait until the next tranche, to the next whether it's the legislation that's pending in front of Congress or not. But so for those who are going to have to do jobs training or retraining because of this COVID layoffs, they're going to, I think, have some problems, aren't they?
Well, you're absolutely right, Governor. You're talking my language here, because it's really important to note that I talked about those good jobs. Well, 25% of the good jobs that are available require learning beyond high school, but not a bachelor's degree. So those are good, solid workforce training programs that launch people into the middle class. We need for folks to both know that the pathways exist. We also need for individuals to be able to get the financial support that they need to pursue those pathways. A lot of credentials that are not degrees, such as some industry recognized certifications and some certificates even, aren't necessarily eligible for financial aid. So how do we get people to pursue those pathways to get the jobs that they need and that we actually need them to have, unless we completely rethink the policy landscape? So I do think that's something that warrants a lot more attention, Governor Wise.
Thank you. So Biv, if I could turn to you, and you've been doing, your organization Learning Heroes, been doing its own polling as well. Where do you think your membership is in terms of various policies? And is there a particular policy that they're ready to advance?
I think that parents don't think about their child through a policy lens per se. So they believe that and I think this showed up in Celinda's data as well, like they believe that the school that they're sending their child to is a good school because they're sending their child to that school. They're making that decision. But building off of Dr. Howard's point around post-secondary success, because that is the aspiration for every family. So 75% of parents think that it's very or extremely important that their child get a 2 or a 4-year degree. So not necessarily a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree. And it's even high, it's not surprisingly, it's higher for African-American parents and it's highest for Hispanic parents, right? Like no surprise that they prioritize education exponentially. And so that just makes those inequities even more unacceptable, right? So the parents who have this aspiration for their children are least likely in our current system to be able to realize that, that dream. And so I think from a policy point of view, it's in that school and district environment to make sure that their children have access to rigorous education, high quality education, which then I think maps back to expectations. So parents need to understand what is expected of their child and how to know that they're learning it so that they can then support their child's learning at home holistically as best they can. And we've seen where parents are engaged in meaningful ways, every parent's engaged, everyone's active, right? But if you have a complete, and our point of view is if you have a complete and accurate picture of how your child's achieving and developing, then you can support your child in the most effective way. Right now, 9 out of 10 parents believe their child's performing at or above grade level in reading and math, and that is regardless of race, income, or education level. So we know that our African-American children and our Hispanic children, 9 out of 10 of them are not performing at grade level. So again, there's sort of this huge equity issue. So for us, policy-wise, creating an expectation for teachers and schools to be giving parents complete and accurate and holistic information about where their children are so that parents can truly partner up with their teachers to support their children is like step one. So for us, it's about back mapping to making sure that principals and teachers have an expectation to engage with family in a 2-way authentic partnership so that parents again can be part of that solution set. And one specific policy I'll say is a potential exciting one, which sounds common sense, but it is not being done anywhere except HB 4545 in Texas. So Texas just passed this bill, which requires the students who did not meet expectations in the STAR report, which is their summative test, and grades 3, 5, and 8, are entitled to what they're calling an accelerated learning community. So each student will get a personalized plan, that includes the parent or the guardian or some caregiver who has to work with the teacher, the principal, the guidance counselor, and the student in developing that plan. So that should not be groundbreaking, but it is groundbreaking policy-wise. So I think it is up to us in the community to make sure that those Texas teachers and principals and families are set up for success to be able to co-create those plans and actually implement them. So there are some policy supports that need to be in place in order to make sure that that's successful. But we're very energized by that concept and think that that's something to really watch and track, because parents and guardians should be a part of their children's learning plans from the beginning. They shouldn't be like on the sidelines, which is typically how parents are treated. So I think that's something to watch from a policy perspective.
Well, that seems to reflect as well what was found in the Lake Research or in the NSBA poll, isn't it, on the great interest in now personalized learning.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, you know, the appreciation that regardless of where a child is learning, that environment needs to be set up to be able to enable that child to learn virtually, in person. And you know, people became creative with learning pods. I mean, I think the learning modes are shifting before us. And so ensuring that children, regardless of where they're learning, after school settings as well, can contribute to that personal child's own trajectory and path. And so I think there's a greater interest in supporting that child more holistically.
And Chip, as I turn to you and the National School Board Association, I just observed once again what struck me in the poll was the emphasis on personalized learning. In the past, I've always felt that was something that the education literati, the advocates and those who are educators talked about, but not something that parents for the most part did. And what I think parents are saying, and and what I've heard in this discussion so far, is I'm very concerned about where my child is, and I want to make sure that whatever system is there addresses my child's needs, not just a cookie cutter approach. So, Chip, don't want to put you on the spot, but you're the CEO of the organization, 14,000 school districts, that ultimately the rubber meets the road at the school district and with the school board. What are you hearing? And I do want to note that even pre-COVID, the National School Board Association was, I thought, taking some bold steps in talking about what should be done in school transformation. And so what do you, now as we're coming through COVID, and you've been with the School Board Association that whole time, coming through COVID, where do you think your members are going, and what is it they're most talking about?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. So yeah, it's interesting. So pre-COVID, early February of 2020, we actually started talking about personalized learning and as a means of school transformation. And it was interesting at the time we did it at our large advocacy institute in Washington. And a couple people thought it was interesting, but they didn't quite see the correlation between how is this an advocacy topic versus how is this just a broad education topic we would talk about more at our annual conference. And what I would counter with was, well, as we go and ask Congress for new resources and new investments in public schools, and they're going to ask us the question, well, why should we invest more in public schools? What are we, what's going to be the outcome? And we looked at it as one of the outcomes that needed to happen was to get at that concept of improving real world skills, 21st century skills, whatever you want to call it, was moving to instructional models that focus on a more personalized learning, on understanding the whole child is another way to talk about it. And so we were moving in that direction. What really I think the pandemic did was it did call attention to, wow, my kid has different issues than my neighbor's kid. Or maybe they have some of the same. And you hear a lot of complaints about, for example, the fact that school was mostly online and some students didn't do very well at all. But the irony is there are some students that actually did better. It is a smaller number, but we've seen a lot of anecdotes around that. And also I would point out that there were some school districts that had already employed some type of innovation around personalized learning, and they actually did really well as a district. during COVID. And it's because they were using these new instructional models. So I now look at this as we're going back to Congress and asking for more resources, as well as using now the existing resources that have passed as a result of the pandemic. This is that rubber meets the road time. It is time to take all of these challenges and turn them into opportunities. And to me, I look at this data, and I was really curious. We asked Celinda and Bob to do this poll on what the difference would be on personalized learning. The numbers were fine a year ago when we polled on it, but they have skyrocketed now. And people now understand that this is really a concept we need to be moving towards. It's important for the future of learning, which is why that dealing with those technology and digital divide issues of homework app is so important, because to have a true personalized learning experience, you need a great teacher, of course. So we've got to work on the teacher shortage and improving professional development for teachers, and so that they can teach in these new instructional patterns. But we also have that technology access, so that the students have access when they're in school and when they're out of school to this interactive digital content that adapts to the learner, that provides, Governor, your term, little data to the teacher on how each student is doing, that each parent can look at. And you all of a sudden you get a better idea of, like, why is Chip struggling in Algebra 2, which I did back in the day. And you can look at trends in the learning as to how that may suggest why that's occurring. Is it just there's a deficiency somewhere, you missed a gap in learning, or is there something else going on that the teacher may be able to observe just by spending more time with the student, which you can have in a personalized learning center? So for us, this is a major development in terms of the poll. It shines a light on something we already thought, and now it validates it. This is something that not only is needed, I think the data suggests it's needed, it's something now the public wants. And so I think it's a whole new way to talk about prioritizing for the future of public schools. And that's why we launched our Public School Transformation Now initiative last October, before the election ended. It didn't really matter who won, who controlled Congress. These are the things we need to be focusing on for the future.
Governor Wise, can I just jump in really quickly? So just along those lines, I think that's super important, but just as a note, when we polled our parents last February, March, the second biggest concern was screen time for their children, understandably. So as we think about this personalized learning kind of framework or framing, I think also addressing and helping parents sort of grapple with too much screen time, enough screen time. How do you define screen time? Not to be afraid of screen time. Like, I feel like that's just another dimension from that parent point of view that will be important just to be upfront and center on as we're thinking about that new personalized learning environment, which I think is super critical. And I agree parents will be supportive, but just to keep in mind that is something that they're focused on.
I would agree with what Bib is saying, by the way. And I would also point out that one of the things we try and tell people is that a lot of the online learning that took place, whether it was on a Zoom platform, Teams, Skype, whatever it is, that's not really what we're talking about in terms of a true personalized learning experience. It's using you may use that as a resource for a half hour a day, but it's really that interactive digital content, the mentoring, the collaboration opportunities, I think, are most important. And certainly, I think teaching good, I would call it digital citizenship, which gets at things like how much time are you spending on on your computer or on your screen. It's all really needs to be part of the whole plan.
Right, and then the relationship with the teacher still is so critical. Like, it doesn't replace so just, I think, personalized learning is one of those definitions that everybody has their own definition. So as this goes more broadly, sort of helping people understand, as you were articulating, the what behind it will be really important to make sure people do have a shared understanding and aren't able to sort of mischaracterize what it is and what it isn't.
Exactly.
And so, Dr. Howard, because I think this discussion of personalized learning also needs to be talked about at the in post-secondary as well. And what do you see as changes coming or should be coming that truly meet the needs of students coming back? If I could, my editorial comment is that what has taken place over the past 18 months, it not only has exposed much of inequity, even more so, but also given us a chance to redesign how the services we provide students where they are. And in terms of the constituency and post-secondary job training and so on, how do we address that?
I think that something that many institutional leaders have recognized is that there are some changes that the pandemic can brought on and induced, and there really should be no reason to go back to the way that things were in terms of some of the practices and processes that were ever present in higher education. So for example, many students actually have said that they want to continue to have some or a majority of their coursework offered in a hybrid setting. Many more students want to continue in that way than do faculty though. So how do you resolve that disconnect? I think it's also important to acknowledge that some students have been very clear that the virtual environment does not work for them. So they are eager to be back face-to-face in a classroom with a faculty member and with their peers. And so moving forward, I think we're going to have to really grapple with how to make this new normal make sense for the learners, for faculty, for the way that institutions do business. And I think that we're going to have to do all of that while we are tackling the workforce training issue that you mentioned, Governor Wise, because we know that some industries and some sectors were hit very hard as a result of the pandemic. And those jobs, many of those jobs are actually not going to come back. So we need to not just upskill people, we need to completely offer new training because they're going to need to go into new jobs because their old jobs are probably gone forever. And so this is the challenge, but also I think the incredible opportunity for institutional leaders and their boards to place innovation at the center of their long-term strategic planning. We also know that many institutions who for forever have been operating on this 2-semester and a summer system have now really recognized that that is an outdated approach and are changing the way that they offer courses, maybe starting courses every 5 weeks or every 4 weeks or on a rotating or revolving basis to meet the needs of their learner population. So I think there are a number of different things that the higher education community can look at as a result of the pandemic. I hope that one of them will be, how can we continue to make sure that we get all students what they need to be successful? We somehow found a way to get a Chromebook in the hand of almost every student in K-12. I have 2 young children. They came home with Chromebooks. We found a way to get every college student, most college students, a laptop and to get them access to high-speed broadband. How can we make sure that we continue to prioritize getting the students the resources they need to be successful?
And I think that quite frankly is the best place to leave this discussion. That's an incredible summation because that's what we're all saying. This is my, as one who spent a long time in public life, this is my optimal and nightmare scenario. It's 2025 and a public official is school board member, governor, member of whomever is at a high school commencement or a college commencement, and the pandemic is done by then. And so, but somebody puts that video camera in the public official's face and says, you know, we just 4 years ago, we came out of the worst experience that this country, shared experience that this country's had since World War II. There was a lot of sacrifice, a lot of pain, a lot of loss in many ways. And at the same time, we had unprecedented federal resources over 3 or 4 years to do something about it. And then here comes the kicker. What difference did you make? And so that to me is the question, and each of you is in a position to truly make that difference, and many others who are watching this. But that's the purpose of the COVID Constituency report, and also a lot of the data. I want to thank Dr. Howard, Bibb, Hubbard, Chip Slavin for the work that they're doing, but also for the reaction to this poll. Chip, I want to thank the National School Board Association very much for commissioning the poll as well. and for the first time trying to pull out what the COVID constituency is about. Cheryl, at this point, I'm going to turn it back to you and thank the Hunt Institute, and perhaps you might talk about some of the activities coming up.
Yeah, and on behalf of the Hunt Institute, I just want to thank our presenter, Celinda Lake and Lake Research Partners, our panelists, and our moderator, Governor Wise, for such an important conversation on insights using polling data. We know there's a lot of polls out there that have kind of these glimmers of hope, and I think help us inform the future of education. So please stay with us for this project in the long term. As Governor Wise mentioned, tomorrow we will be releasing a report called the COVID Constituency, Emerging Priorities for Education Leaders. That really is the anchor of this work. We will make sure registrants and attendees get a copy of that report when it comes out. And then later this week, we also have our second webinar of this 4-part series. And this webinar series really now shifts. As you've heard from today from Celinda, the digital divide matters. We definitely know it's going to be a priority for the COVID constituency to have a solution for this. So our series will pivot now to 3 webinars really focused on the digital divide. The first one focused on digital safety for teachers and students. As we know, kids remaining online, we want to protect them and the teachers and their data and information. So we have a really important conversation happening Thursday. So please sign up. We have a webpage for the COVID constituency work where you can stay in the loop. We also have a webpage with all of our upcoming webinars. So please join us again. And thank you again to our panelists and all of our attendees for this wonderful conversation. And have a great rest of your Tuesday.
So I just want to